Hello, my name is Jay Carpenter, and today is Saturday, April the 9th, 2022. It's 11:03 a.m. Arizona time, and today we have a Desert Blockchain open house, and this is an opportunity for people to visit here at Desert Blockchain Camp in person. We'll have a little bit of a open workshop for about an hour, and then we will have a lunch break and turn off the Zoom, and then we'll reconvene at 1 p.m. For further open discussion if anybody has any, and that's our format. So we appreciate the support. This is entirely community supported through the Patreon citizen account, and contributions $10 a month. So if you're interested in participating via Zoom in person, then please join us as a citizen and sign up for $10 per month. So Charlie, anything you would like to cover today? As we get started?
I don't know cover as much as I was going to ask the group if anybody's there. Working on a project right now where we're looking at building a smart contract that operates off a Chainlink data feed. I was curious if anybody had used that before with an Oracle.
I have not. I have met some of the folks at Chainlink a couple of years ago. I'm really interested in how that goes for you. I would love for you to do a session on that once you work through it. So that's my request. I think that's a really, that would be a really valuable topic to do. I could even see us doing like a monthly session on that. So I don't know, but
okay.
I'm really delighted that you're working on that. So
yeah, and for anybody who's watching on the stream or maybe down the road on a recording, if you're not familiar with Chainlink, or there's a couple companies in the space like Augur, but an Oracle is essentially a way to bring in data that doesn't actually live on the blockchain and use it to process agreements such as smart contracts for honestly an endless array of possibilities. If anybody's looking at playing around with these, the caveat that I'd say is definitely do your research. A lot of the fundamentals of cybersecurity, risk management come into play. One of the things that Chainlink kind of prides itself on is aggregating a wide stream of inputs to a consensus that is a little bit more accurate and cannot be tampered with. That's the kind of theory behind it. So, for instance, if you wanted to vote, what's your favorite sport, Jay?
well, probably golf.
Golf. Okay. So if we wanted to make a kind of a predictive market for, let's say, a bet on what over under par for one of your favorite golfers in the Masters down in Georgia, this weekend, you could do it pulling in a feed from results from one website. But if somebody placed a fairly large bet in this example on the outcome of that data, and it could be manipulated very easily with just one website, the incentive to tamper with that would be incredibly high, especially if the amount was high enough. By pulling in, let's say, the results from 200 websites or 200 different streams, be it social media or website or an authorized feed from, I don't know, ESPN or something, you're managing that risk through kind of dispersing where that data is being collected. it's a very interesting mechanism for achieving consensus, and obviously so is blockchain. So I think kind of pairing those two is a very natural process, especially given that not all data that we want to access for outcomes is living on chain. So,
yeah, the idea, and you've articulated it well, Charlie, but the idea and why this is so important in the overall scheme of things is this is a really a bridge that it's probably the best bridge that we have between electrons and molecules. And, you know, this is a big, if we can create bridges that adhere to the intentions of decentralization, of, you know, zero trust, of, you know, diversification, that's a huge win all the way around, and all sorts of things start to open up. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but certainly there's a lot of people that would love to see a really strong solution that achieves as close to 100% of trust, or, you know, zero trust in terms of the source of the data, but trustable outcome reporting, an event in the real world to an event in the digital world. Does that make sense?
I mean, that definitely makes sense, and I love the way you put it. You know, crossing the, you know, electrons and molecules. I mean, that really is what it is. It's bringing in, it's serving as that bridge to allow so many things to happen in a verifiable way through the blockchain, that they're currently underutilized at the very least, and impossible at the other end of that. Obviously, companies like Chainlink are very dedicated to solving some of these problems, but even if that gets solved, and it's in one use case, there's going to be, you know, because anything you can measure quantifiably, or even you know, using data science to categorize data in different ways, could potentially be used to create a identifiable outcome that could thereby be written into something like a smart contract. So I don't know, I just see it's just absolutely endless amounts of potential, especially when you combine that with the ability to perform micropayments, and thereby creating the real world mechanisms for creating incentives, productivity, or even, you know, self-care, or you know, however you want to apply that. But I think the next 10 years we're gonna really see the adoption of this, and I think people are gonna really be blown away by the projects that people wind up using it for. So I will absolutely be working on that in kind of my own projects, and I would love to do, follow up with that with the group.
Cool. Are you familiar with the construct or the approach called digital twins?
I am not. No, it sounds very interesting.
I've just heard the term, and I've spoken to some people that are knowledgeable in the general realm, but apparently this approach called digital twins is a way to track like supply chain items. And I don't fully understand it, but I'm bringing it up just so that we can kind of put it on the table and maybe take a look at it. But I'm pretty sure, my intuition is that it's along the lines of an oracle, but they're trying to accomplish the same. And I could be totally wrong about this. It's just kind of my, you know, guess.
That makes sense, though. I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific phrase. I'll absolutely be Googling that as soon as our session's over. But I do know the concept that you're kind of illustrating there is absolutely something companies are working on. So I may be mispronouncing their name, but it's Tremi I think they're an offshoot, or one of the co-founders of Consensus started it. But they do off-chain supply chain tracking from fish to plate, and it's really using a combination of RFID technology and some other mechanisms to confirm. And really, what we're talking about is identity management for a unique commodity, right? So, that fish that gets pulled out of the ocean, how do you know that's the same fish that's being served in that kitchen? And they're really kind of focused on solving that. But that same idea can be applied across many industries. The one that I have heard that I really like the example was, anything that's used for production of internal components for, let's say, pacemakers, or anything goes into the body. You need to be very sure of where that was produced and the quality of that, because it can be very detrimental to your health if you have a low quality replacement that got somehow swapped out in that supply chain. So I'm sure people could think of a million other use cases, but I wonder if that digital twin concept kind of comes in there with that, whether it's RFID, or I don't know if you could do an on-spot DNA test or something to that effect to verify those things off chain.
Yeah, I don't know either, but in your exploration of Chainlink, you might want to do a little research on the digital twin concept. And then, I'd love it if you could let us know what you find out on that. So I'm going to have to mute for just a moment, Charlie, and make a request of someone. Hang on.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So, yeah, I didn't see what you posted in the chat, but
Yeah, well, we were kind of doing that. I just took a second to grab Chainlink's over very short introductory video to kind of what their bridge mechanism looks like, and for an oracle. So
cool. And I think it's important to mention that I don't know that much about it, but I think there is a sort of an opportunity for people to serve as oracles and earn money doing that, building up like a trust reputation and so forth, and then being the human bridge between the molecules and the electrons. And I'm pretty sure that's an opportunity to kind of do like a gig economy thing where you can do that service and earn some sort of compensation for it. Is that your understanding as well?
yeah, and I think the opportunity for that is going to be growing immensely as people really start to, I mean, you get into identity management and what's your personal data, and how can you monetize that through blockchain technology and wearables, for example, zero knowledge proofs to only kind of put out there what you're choosing to. And I think companies are going to get into a kind of a competitive arena with that, where you're going to start to have some of these companies looking to actually buy some of that data from you as an individual. From a larger industry perspective, I could easily see not only the individual and their reputation being kind of grown and really compensated for that. But also, I think you'll start to see some hardware companies get into this game too. Again, through aggregations or aggregating data. So let's say, you had, temperature sensors that were placed around the world on top of, every building, and they get a micro payment per, hour that they're active or something, or any other data that would be beneficial to collect. Right now, we're seeing that from very centralized sources, and I think that's going to get more decentralized as this progresses, and I think that'll feed into these Chainlink, Oracle networks, and other companies that are doing that. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be compensated in the future, especially when you can start building a monetary reward around that. There's more money to kind of in the pot to pay out to people for increasing the ability to monetize these applications.
Yeah, and along those lines, we've had sessions regarding non-fungible tokens and authenticating non-fungible tokens, and we've talked about people acting as a putting their stamp of authenticity on a particular non-fungible token. So I think there's an opportunity for people to start to build a business and a career that's related to that. So and I'm just kind of throwing that out, that's another realm that we'll be exploring and actually prototyping and piloting in the near future. So, all right. Anything else along those lines, Charlie?
No, but I look forward to keeping that conversation going down the road.
Cool. I would like to throw out the topic of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. We had a little email exchange with somebody that's interested in that, and I was at ASU Law this week, and that topic came up. So have you done much with DAOs or looked at DAOs, how to set them up, how to run them, that sort of thing?
I mean, I definitely don't have hands-on experience with DAO creation. I know that, people, there are definitely some considerations that have to be done to go into that process, though. I mean, especially with, regards to something like the DAO hack. I mean, if you're not familiar with that, not necessarily yourself, Jay, I know you are, but people looking into that, and at what point do some of the incentives that are built into compensating members in those DAOs, start looking like maybe securities, or staying away from that, or at the very least going through the necessary steps to make sure you're not getting into trouble there. That said, I think when it comes to blockchain DAO, I mean, at a basic level, I mean, you're talking about decentralization of voting mechanisms for one example, guidance for creating direction in companies without having to have these large centralized traditional structures. I think it shows a lot of promise. I mean, I know groups like Onyx have been looking into it. Jay, we've talked to them, and be very curious to see kind of what their process looks like, because I know they're trying to document it a little bit for people looking to get into that.
Yeah, here's my concern around DAOs. I think the sense that I get as people talk about this and express a desire to stand one up is it seems to be perceived as a way to address regulatory concerns, where people are saying, well, let's stand up a DAO and we can let it go, and there's it just seems like they want to stand something up that's going to be difficult to regulate, if that makes sense. Hey, Mark.
Hey.
Welcome. We're talking about DAOs right now.
Oh,
so,
perfect.
yeah. So do you have an interest in that?
Yeah, I'm actually on a paper I'm working on right now, diving into DAOs just a little bit as a way to potentially get around for NFTs, to get around SEC regulations because
Yeah.
There you go.
oh, is that what you were just talking about?
I was just saying that the sense that I get about when people are talking about DAOs and their desire to stand up a DAO is they're trying to address regulatory concerns primarily.
Yeah, because then you don't have, in terms of the security or whatever, what's the investment contract or whatever the term is that I'm blanking on right now, but it requires
The Howey test,
under the Howey test,
where it's like a passive
yeah,
income
or
relying upon the work
efforts of a person
of
or
somebody
something.
else.
Yeah,
Right,
but
for expected returns.
yeah, Pierce.
Yeah.
said, I don't think that really fits with the DAO. So, but
okay, but that was Pierce is not in role now. Is he?
no, I don't.
That
well,
was
yeah,
the last administration.
yeah. So everything's kind of up in the air, but it's at least that's something where it was kind of hinted at that.
Yeah.
could be
Mark is
something
not a lawyer, but he is a law student at ASU.
Is that Charles?
That's
Yeah.
Charles.
Hey, Mark.
Okay.
So
I would say that it's not flying. The motivation is not flying under the radar. And obviously, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not presenting legal advice here, but I would say that the lawyers and political representatives that I've spoken with are definitely trying to find ways to regulate or find a way to implement regulations that can be kind of nailed down. And I feel like that those DAOs are going to be pretty high up on that list. I mean, I think they're going to have strict scrutiny of how we test and making sure people aren't kind of leaning into those gains. Now, for voting mechanisms, that's a different story, right? I mean, there's yeah.
Excuse me, Charles. I'm going to excuse myself to order the lunch, and then I'm going to come back. But I think we've got a really, really rich conversation here. So I'm going to let you guys talk about DAOs and the voting and the regulatory issues while I go order lunch. And then if somebody can pick it up, that would be great. So, all right.
Well, Mark, could I give you a prompt maybe to get you started? I'd like to hear kind of maybe some of the. It sounds like I heard NFT and DAO in the same sentence there. I mean, so I mean the idea here is whether it's maybe you get additional access to voting rights in a DAO by having specific ownership of NFTs, right? I mean, let's say there's 1,000 outstanding votes in a available. Maybe the NFT owners are able to, pocket more of those, or founding members. I mean, it's not just NFT based, right? So, have you seen anything like that as kind of like a benefit of owning those NFTs? And maybe that's one application of separating it from just a digital copy of a piece of art. There's actually like
yeah, so the way I'm looking at it is through a real estate lens, and not even just real estate, but physical property or physical assets. And the problem with especially real estate is the barrier to entry in terms of pricing and being able to secure traditional means of funding. And so, the idea, and of course, this is where sort of the Howey test stems from, is people say, well, why don't I just fractionalize the ownership of the property? And then it's sort of a crowd-funded source. And then the SEC, of course, says, well, that's a security. So you need to be register. You can do that, but you need to be registered as a broker, and that's just a disaster because registration is an arduous and very expensive process. So where DAOs would come in to provide value to the NFT, where I was sort of thinking of it is you have a DAO where, and maybe it's a pool of NFTs that are tied to ownership of assets. Like you could think of, for instance, a car club where people say, right now there's, like I think car clubs could be a good example where it's maybe not through a security lens, but where people are like, hey, we want to all own these cars, but I don't want to be stuck with one classic car or one sports car, whatever. So let's start a DAO, and the title of each car is held by an NFT, and then this DAO owns these specific NFTs, and then you get your vote by owning in the DAO. The voting rights are tied to your fractionalized, you create fractionalized coins for each NFT.
Right. So we're talking about tokenization.
Yeah, exactly.
Of assets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
So there's that, or you could do the same thing with real estate, and it could just be like the way I sort of more envision it is maybe starting out just for somebody who wants to branch out and like short-term rentals or income properties, right, are very cool, but and there's a lot of people who I think would be able to handle managing them, but they're just never going to be able to get the funding and see maybe cool opportunities. So you have title of the property, and that's sort of, there's issues with that, but if you can overcome some of these issues, have the ownership of the property represented by an NFT, and then potentially, right now at least, you may be able to get around the securities consequences of that by having a DAO operate it. So that way it's all voted on. So the DAO owns the NFT that then owns it. Wyoming, I believe, will like officially recognize a DAO as a legal entity. And people say, well, the problem is it's not recognized outside of Wyoming. So how do you, as a DAO, do anything outside of Wyoming? And my proposed answer to that is the DAO owns an LLC. So then the LLC can operate anywhere it wants in a legally recognizable way, and the DAO controls the LLC. I don't know if that.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. So but does that kind of answer what you were going towards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a cross section. It's a very rich answer because it's a cross section of DAOs and NFTs and tokenization of assets and essentially off-chain business entities that are interacting with these things. So yeah. I mean, hey Jay.
So I'd like to run an idea by everybody here and whoever's watching this. This is something I'm working on, and I'm looking for feedback as a governance model to address the regulatory realm that seems to be in a quandary about taking the legacy constructs for regulation and consumer protection, and how do you construct something that will work in a decentralized way. So if I could kind of have the floor for a few minutes, and I'm going to move this whiteboard around so that hopefully it can be seen. But Mark, you can stay in the pictures fine. Okay, so the idea is this. Let me talk about the fundamental disconnect. Okay, whoops. So the fundamental disconnect that I see with the regulatory efforts to create a bridge between legacy regulation, and which was for centralized constructs, and regulating decentralized constructs, is an attempt to apply the same fundamental assumptions and mindset to what was in the past to what currently stands today. So, and I've been through this before. I experienced this in the telecommunications world, because in the mid-90s, the internet emerged. And when the internet emerged, and I got involved in the early 2000s, actually advising the Federal Communications Commission and working with the telecommunications industry, the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, in terms of, you know, how do you structure, how do you modify or create regulation that accomplishes what was done when we were talking about the copper line telephone network into the internet realm. And here's what the disconnect was in that time, and I think the same thing is happening here, and I'll explain both. So number one is all the regulatory constructs for the copper line telephone network were based upon circuit switching, which is akin to and analogous to centralized sources of authority and trust. Okay, so when you've got circuit switches, it's easy to trace what happens between point A and point B. It's sort of like classical mechanics and physics. You know, you got this pretty clear, if billiard ball A hits billiard ball B, it ends up in position C. Okay. Then what happened was this new technology was introduced for the internet, which is called packet switching. And packet switching, even though the experience of, you know, you pick up the phone and, you know, you pick up the phone, you dial a number, and you get connected to somebody at another point. Even though that seemed to be almost identical, if not identical, what was happening in between was 180 degrees different, because the difference between circuit switching and packet switching, you could no longer identify what was going on between point A and point B, because it was designed so that you're doing something 180 degrees opposite from a circuit switch. Okay. And what that brought up in the regulatory realm was it was becoming impossible, and I'm pretty sure it still exists to this day, some 25 years later. It's impossible. Oh, this is perfect. Hey, Joseph, you're just in time. We're talking about an extension of what we were talking about at ASU Law. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit for Joseph. Joseph is also a law student at ASU. So welcome. Good to see you. We have.
Hey, Joseph.
So yeah, if you can kind of scoot over here, so maybe you can get into the camera. Sure. A little bit. And you know Mark? Yeah. Okay. So Joseph and I had a conversation, and actually we're talking about collaborating on this and writing something up. But there's a huge need to bridge the legacy regulatory of realm of centralized constructs with decentralized constructs. And I'm making an analogy right now because I lived through this in the mid-90s when the legacy regulatory realm for the old copper line network was in a quandary about how do you regulate what seemed to be phone calls in a more of a decentralized packet switching network, which we call the internet. So it seemed like everything was the same. You would pick up this device, you would punch in a telephone number, what looked like a telephone number, and you would talk. I would talk to Mark, or I would talk to Joseph, and you could be anywhere in the world. But from a regulatory standpoint, because you don't have this well-defined deterministic circuit switching, which is, that's not totally an accurate analogy, but because you didn't have that, and all of a sudden everything was dispersed, and what seemed to be a standard phone call was actually spread all over the world, it became impossible to define what a telephone call was. Okay. And in fact, as packet switching progressed, i.e. the internet, things started to morph together. So what's the difference between like what we're experiencing here, which also includes video? What's the difference between this and a phone call? Nothing. We're talking with one another over a distance in actually a higher quality transmission than the old 64 kilobit restriction on a copper line network. And we now have a video transmission. So what's the difference between, is this what we're experiencing now? Is it a phone call? Is it a radio broadcast? Is it a television broadcast? It's all of the above. And each one of those, telephone calls, radio transmissions, and television, were all regulated differently prior to packet switching. So my point is that a shift in the technology can actually start to blur, if not completely disintegrate, the distinctions between what was regulated in the past. And the same thing is happening now. Is this a currency? Is it a commodity? Is it a security? Well, guess what? It's all of the above, right? Okay. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, that totally does.
So, Charlie, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you kind of point out, I'm sure the discussions at ASU law will back this up, is that it often takes, the law a while to catch up to how it wants to categorize technological advancement, right? So that's something we see a lot. And I think that's really, when it comes down to what you're saying, Jay, is how does this integrate into the governance that we kind of abide by or are held to, right? In a court environment, whether it's federal or state or local.
Well, I assert that it's impossible to solve using the body of law and case precedents that exists, that was created using centralized constructs of authority and truth. Okay. So just go with me a little bit on that premise, that all the efforts, all the angst that's going on right now in the regulatory policy making bodies, they are trying to solve an unsolvable problem.
Because the framework, yeah, they operate.
Well, because the whole body of regulation, case law, and everything was built upon a centralized constructs. Okay, so here's when we have central constructs versus decentralized. All right, and we talked about this yesterday. I'm going to assert that the disconnect stems from this. In a central construct, from trust arises distrust. So you start with a basis of trust, and as time goes on and actions go on, there's a propensity for distrust to emerge. And all the efforts are built around trying to prevent that distrust from happening. So we go from trust as time moves on to distrust. In decentralized constructs, it's exactly the opposite. Very much akin to the difference between circuit switched data and communications and packet switched. We start with, well, from distrust arises trust. That flip-flopping creates the regulatory and the policy-making quandary that people are currently facing.
Well, and it really reflects the power dynamics that are inherent in central versus decentralized structures too, right? So, or top-down, bottom-up policy creation, right?
Mm-hmm. That's great that you mentioned that, Charlie, because I'm going to make another point that's, I think, particularly relevant right now at this moment. In approximately 2010, we saw a phenomenon happen we term the middle or the Arab Spring, where all of a sudden, if you had said that Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, Hosni Mubarak, and I can't remember the other, let's call them centralized sources of policy control. If you had said like 2 or 3 years prior to that, that by 2011, those folks would be gone, you would have been laughed at. People would have said, there is no way that Muammar Gaddafi is going to be ousted. And in fact, he was. And what was the source of that? It was social media. It was this, all of a sudden, this decentralization of truth and trust and so forth undermined the centralized sources of power that existed in the Middle East. What are we experiencing today in the Ukraine and Russian conflict? I assert we are seeing a further advancement of power prevailing over force. So the power is in the ability to have decentralized communications around the world that's doing real-time streaming of events in a conflict. I assert that the power of that freedom of the press that can't be controlled any longer is prevailing over the fear of the military force that would have had the advantage in the past. Okay. So
Social media warfare.
well, it's like a new realm of freedom of the press. So all of a sudden, freedom of information, of communication, of relationship is triumphant over the ability to contain relationships and to treat others as objects. So in the past military conflicts, what's happened is, you know, Joseph Stalin was able to starve to death like 5 million Ukrainians. People were dying in the streets, but we didn't have the ability to communicate the human side of that. It was like this massive numbers that they all just became numbers. Yesterday, I read in the Wall Street Journal about this 68-year-old man that was trying to walk to a school for, I don't know, disabled children or whatever and teach, and he stumbled into a no zone by the Russians and was shot by a sniper. We didn't have that ability in the past to humanize the conflict. And that ability, the ability for me to sit there and watch the Ukrainian ground forces disable and take out the Russian T-72 tanks because they know a vulnerability, that's very powerful. And it's along the lines of this flip-flopping of centralized and decentralized constructs and information sources and so forth. So anyway,
Jay, can I throw one point in there?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think, you know, with regards to that, we're talking about it from, you know, looking at what's happening on the ground from the Ukrainian side. But I think that what you're talking about is exemplified as well on the Russian side as well. So not only are you seeing, you know, kind of these personalized narratives, these stories of people being affected by the consequences of, you know, invasion and war on the streets, but you're also seeing essentially dissension on the Russian side from the people who are actually speaking out against their government, or at least the actions of their government through social media. So, and that's I mean, I'm agreeing with you, and I'm going one step further into that. I mean, I think seeing behind the lines is, I mean, it's incalculable, really, how much that affects the dynamic of communication within wartime, right?
Absolutely. So there's 2 points that you bring up, Charlie, that I think are very relevant. Number one is we, in this go round, and including the Ukrainians, we are not demonizing and trying to put a blanket, you know, categorization of the Russians, like they're all evil.
Mm-hmm.
We are actually able to see both sides, the human side of the mourning Russian mothers about their lost sons and daughters that are in the military, and the same thing in the front page of the Wall Street Journal. We did a session on this where the mother is, you know, embracing the face of her, the body of her son, and the father can't even bear to watch that. there's a new experience. It's no longer feasible to objectify the people that are involved in the conflict. You know, we used to be able to drop the mother of all bombs into Afghanistan that would have devastation for like 100-mile radius or whatever it is, kill people. And, you know, over here on the other side of the world, it was like, oh, well, it's there. That's no longer the case with the decentralized sources of information and so forth. Now, so I'll leave it at that, but to go back to our prior conversation about what we were talking about oracles and the bridging between molecules and electrons, it's critical to have some sort of trusted source that can authenticate a non-fungible token or a news item or a video feed or whatever, and say, you know, I witnessed this, and maybe have oracles or authoritative sources on both sides of the conflict say, yes, I witnessed this, this is true. Because what happens is the centralized power on either side will say this was staged, it's fake, and whatever.
Or one of those deep fake videos. I mean, even from a national, like a spokesperson, I mean, even that is being put into question. And since we don't know who minted that particular or issued that particular piece of content anymore, even that is being put into question.
Yeah, and that seed of doubt historically was enough to gut the power of whatever people were seeing, right? So so in the realm of this bridging of molecules and electrons and having some sort of process in between where there can be some sort of authentication provided by humans, machines, combination, whatever, that's really, really important. And it's coming into play in this realm of war that we're experiencing. And don't get me wrong, I'm trying to be very Swiss neutral about this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even neutral anymore.
Yeah, but so the point of the conversation is to start to highlight some distinctions between how things went in the past and how things are, or what's possible now. Okay, and it's certainly relevant in the context of armed conflict, but I think it's also relevant in the context of how do we create a new regulatory regime
Mm-hmm.
that actually works. Okay. So I'm going to erase this and we're going to go beyond noon if that's cool with everybody.
Hey, Jay, what you said borrow on 35th, what?
35th and Bethany.
Okay.
Do you need the address sent to you?
No, I mean.
It's on the northeast corner of 35th.
Yeah.
Go down to Bethany, take a left, and then it's 35th Avenue. It'll be on your right. Tiffany is the person who took the order.
Okay.
So go ahead, Mark.
Would you say, like, for me, when I'm thinking about how the regulatory agencies, at least in the United States, trying to address these things moving forward,
It seems to me that the problem is where the motivation behind the regulation in the first place is no longer realistic, in the sense that, like with the SEC, they try to have this paternalistic approach of, we're trying to protect you from harming yourself. And I think that was doable when, before the internet and before money was movable as it is now, where if you wanted to operate in an exchange outside of the US, you either had to physically move outside of the US to do that, or go on a trip, whatever, or you had to call up a broker or go through a broker who would say, that's illegal. I'm not doing that. But now it's, they can say, oh, you're not an accredited investor, or you're somebody who we think you will not make the best decision, so we need to protect you. That person can very easily hop on the internet, go through a VPN, and do it anyways, even though the SEC is trying to prevent them. So it just seems to me like the motivation needs to be changed in terms of, rather than trying to prevent people, let's encourage it in a way where we're sort of enticing policy that, I don't know, encourages people to do things more wisely, rather than try to prevent them from making bad decisions.
Yep,
or
that's
them.
perfect. Go ahead, Charlie.
Mark, yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, I'm not a law student, but part of my studies include taking some of the courses that Duke offers for fintech policy and law. And I mean, one thing you notice right away is that we have a very disjointed regulatory body that has little bits and pieces of oversight depending on the very specific circumstance. That is to say, there's no one body that controls the rules and regulations that govern fintech, right? So maybe, and I mean that paternalistic, philosophy definitely guides a lot of policy making, right? So I mean, you mentioned accredited investors. That's a great example. I mean, a lot of the reason I think that we've seen such an explosion in tokenization of assets or blockchain cryptocurrencies is because those restrictions exist. I don't know that we would have seen quite the outpouring of commitment to the community had they not, because there would have been alternate avenues there. That is to say, sometimes, what could be at least the argument made for overregulation is guiding people to find alternatives, right? So in that, since we do kind of have multiple bodies that are not really, they haven't solidified through regulation what they do and don't control, and a lot of this stuff is still up in the air. It might give states a good position to carve themselves out a position because they're not having to be restricted by federal guidelines yet, to prove use cases, to give regulatory sandboxes a chance to kind of help their states flourish and bring in innovative players into their tax base, really. So I don't know. I guess I'm very curious to see how maybe states' rights or state direction or state initiatives can help prove the use cases, so that maybe some of these paternalistic instincts of regulatory bodies that are on a federal level can do this. Well, yeah, this is a concern, but we have seen through these initiatives that with these provisions in mind, they can actually provide a lot of potential wealth for maybe underserved communities, for example, or we're not seeing that our worst fears are being realized when given the opportunity to kind of run a little bit. I guess that's an optimistic perspective, but I think Maricopa County, I know, and Arizona and Wyoming are all trying to kind of walk down that path a little bit. I mean, in your backgrounds, do you see that as a valid argument?
It's totally valid, Charlie, and you're hitting upon some of the key fundamental considerations and points that are being grappled with in the, okay, what's next? How do we create innovation in the regulatory realm and so forth? Yeah. And actually, Joseph and I touched upon some of those great things, and you have teed up what I'll now jump to. I was going to go to some intermediary points, but I'm going to throw out something to consider, all of us to consider, and whoever's watching this, as an approach to crafting a new regulatory realm that might be attractive to the states as well as the federal governments, as well as to legacy sovereignties around the world. Okay. And what I call this is federated consumer safeguards. So federated consumer safeguards. Now, what's the intention? Because you touched upon it, Charlie. The intention is to mitigate, dampen, prevent harm to consumers, right? That's what the legacy realm. Now they did it in a, like I think the term is priori, in advance, restrictive and punitive approach, right? So it restricts, try to craft policy that's in advance, that anticipates fraudulent or harmful activity. And if that harmful or activity is detected that maybe hasn't yet created harm, there are punitive consequences. What if there was a way to provide some safeguards or reimbursement or restitution after the fact that allowed unpermissioned innovation, and instead of punitive, it's actually like a restorative. So in other words, like insurance. Okay. So what if it looked like this? What if Mark, Joseph, and Jay have a new decentralized blockchain idea? We read a white paper, whatever. So this is the JMJ coin, okay? And we have a new consensus algorithm. We have a new, maybe, networking protocol, all these sort of things. And, at the start, maybe it's, let's say the ICO, people put in maybe 5 million, okay? So that's your exposure. We float coins and we've raised $5 million, okay? Reasonable. Now, what we want is, and we've got, let's say, 1,000 token holders or coin holders, coins. So the total exposure is $5 million, 1,000 coins, 5,000 each, yeah. Just for, so, and we don't even know who these 1,000 coins are, who the holders are. And we don't know who's going to build this because it's open source. We can't really identify, we might be able to identify Joseph, Mark, and Jay as sort of the writers of the white paper, but we're just throwing that white paper out there. And we might even be using pseudonyms, right? Because the most famous is Satoshi Nakamoto, who we still don't know who that is. So the premises of the legacy constructs would dictate that the regulators need to know, okay, who are the definitive people working on this? Who are the definitive people building it? How is it going to perform? All these things in advance, which is really impossible identify, determine, and it might change. What if we start with proof of work and then move to proof of stake? You know, what if we change the white paper or the governance or whatever? What if we, you know, do something that completely crashes the network? What if Ethereum, in their transition to proof of stake, corrupts the network such that there's like a DAO where, you know, $60 million is siphoned off? Because nothing malicious, it was just somebody didn't
Turns it in a smart contract or something.
So all those things are difficult, if not impossible, to determine in the projecting out into the future. Okay, and in order to craft a set of rules in advance, you would have to write all these rules that are prescriptive as to what you can and cannot do in anticipation of some potential future harm. Okay. So these are this group we'll call like the players, as if they were players on a football team. All right. Now we've got the regulators over here, the states, as you mentioned. Call them states. And these are like the referees. Okay. These are the folks that are trying to anticipate or reduce the potential harm for the consumers. Okay. What's missing is the coach. Okay. The coach being some entity or knowledgeable source that can basically coach these folks and also serve as a source of somebody to look to who's sort of like the adult in the mix. All right, to use a bad analogy, a liaison, or you know, a sort of almost like a fiduciary. So those are the three things in the sandbox situation. So the sandboxes that I'm aware of, which I think is a great opening approach to how do we mesh, how do we go from the legacy centralized regulatory realm to the decentralized regulatory realm. I think the sandboxes are a great step in a workable direction. But what's been missing is this coach function. Okay, there hasn't been some entity that is knowledgeable and knows how to, you know, not only understand the regulatory, all the regulatory realms and levels, and also is familiar with what it takes to build one of these decentralized constructs, which is a lot of technical talent. And they provide some sort of, let's say, financial backstop. Okay. I think if you had these three things dancing together, then all of a sudden you could create a realm where things could be tried without trying to prescriptively throttle them in advance. Okay. Then let's say, you know, time moves on. This is time. And X happens. And some of these 1,000 coin holders say, hey, you guys didn't audit your code, something happened, and boom, my coins went from $5,000 a coin to now they're worth $250 a coin. I've lost, you know, $49,750. And what happened? Who's responsible for that? Well, what if there was a fund, let's say a $3 million fund, that this coach it's like 13, but let's assume it's 3 million out of the 5 million that was raised. What if there was a fund, sort of like a bonding fund or an escrow fund or insurance, where these coin holders could then make a claim on that $3 million fund? They wouldn't be completely made whole, but it would serve, and I'm just pulling $3 million out of the air. There's nothing magical about that particular number. I'm just saying, if there was something between $0 and $5 million where coin holders could then burn their coins and say, okay, I'm burning my JMJ coin, and I'm going to draw some amount of financial reimbursement from this fund. That to me seems like it would go quite a bit of the way towards the intention of the legacy regulatory realm of providing some sort of safeguard or backstop for, you know, people that have put up money in a decentralized.
So the whole point of the fund is basically to sort of appease the legacy regulators to get them in a position where they're willing to sort of allow this.
Yes.
Because my problem or my sort of curiosity on this is, I think maybe it's just a lot of people don't look at it in the way they should, like, and I get what you're saying, you know, it's there to appease the legacy board. And I think, you know, the people who are at the legacy, that's something maybe they need.
Well,
but
it's more than appease, Mark. It's to achieve the same end result.
Well, but what I'm getting at is, like, with stocks, they allow, you know, the legacy, you know, they allow stocks, but in the same way, you can put in money for a stock that's been regulated and approved for you know, an initial opening, and then it could just go to zero, and everybody accepts that, well, that's the risk of, you know, these investments, and the legacy is allowed to, you know, allows that to run. But then when it comes to something that's new, they're like, oh, but what if people lose their investment? It's like, well, that already happens,
Yeah.
and you're okay with that. So
Yep. But let's assume that that I think the Steve Jobs quote is that, hey, you allow people to gamble,
exactly, yeah.
go to the, you know, Las Vegas and put all their money down
Yeah.
and possibly lose the whole thing. But here you're trying to, you know, put all these what ifs in place and
Yeah.
prevent that. So let's assume that that's not going to fly, that the regulators will never embrace,
Yeah.
hey, let's just treat this like a bet at the
Well,
gambling
there's a
table.
big distinction though between stocks and this hypothetical, which is in stocks, at least what we're put forward is the stocks aren't going to get stolen from underneath the stockholders. Whereas in this situation, you might get hacked and your
That's
coins
true.
might get stolen. So this might be more of a insurance, as you say, for those types of
To help bridge the gap.
exactly,
Yeah.
and maybe a rug pull, stuff like that. We're talking more specifically fraud and malfeasance.
Yeah.
Not necessarily speculation from going to 5,000 to 0.
Yeah. So whatever the loss cost, whatever creates the loss, instead of like with the stock example, if I buy, you know, JMJ stock, common stock, and then it tanks and goes to zero, the recourse now is to throw, you know, Joseph, Mark, and Jay in jail, take all their assets, and try to compensate or make partially whole investors from punitive action versus a restorative action like a fund like this. Okay.
So this fund's going to be coming specifically from the company that would be losing they're or be harming the consumers.
Well, there could be insurance companies that
No,
you think have
Let-
funds.
let me go to the next step, because I'm gonna answer that. And if you guys want some pizza, there's pizza over there. So I'm probably gonna grab some. So is this fairly clear? So imagine if things work like this, because there's also I assert there is a knowledge lag between, what's happening in the contemporary decentralized innovation space and the ability for, and this is nothing disparaging for the regulatory realm, but just to keep up with all this and have the breadth of knowledge and even the knowledge of who's involved in this, what's the quality of the developers, getting an assessment of all that stuff, sort of like a VC does, is I would say almost impossible for the regulators.
They have to have some wins. They have to actually pay for themselves. They need to have some court cases that they win against these fraudulent companies and pull some money back. Otherwise, there's no incentive for them to really do this work.
Yeah, so what if there was this? What if you have JMJ coin? And the initial is 5 mil. But JMJ, white paper, DOW, whatever. And by the way, I think this works for a DOW as well as a decentralized construct that's originated by what I'll call a benevolent dictator. So, and I won't name names, but whether this is DAO, whether it's a defined group, whatever it is, and this is, I'll say B 3.0, DW 3.0. All right, just to make clear what we're talking about. What if part of their process was to go to, let's say, DW 3.0 Foundation A, and same thing here, B, and C. So find 3 foundations of established decentralized constructs that have, clearly been operating for a certain period of time, has a substantial market capitalization. How the thing works, what are the consensus mechanisms, and so forth. Have these 3 federate together to provide, let's say instead of 5 million, a $3 million, let's say, what do I want to call it? Like restoration fund, okay? And maybe they don't have to set aside the cash. Now, in exchange for that, JMJ starts sending JMJ tokens or coins, which doesn't cost them anything, but they're sending those to here, here, and here. Okay. So all of a sudden you've got this something that's akin to like an incubator or a VC situation with some recourse for the coin holders to at least get a partial restoration of whatever they put into this.
It'd be
Now-
cool if you could have that restoration fund parked in a stable coin that's earning interest as well. You could, I mean, you could, I don't know, just a thought.
So that's the view from the player and the coach side. Okay, makes sense. Now let's take a look at it from the regulator and the referee side. Okay, so why would state XZ state, or regime, sovereignty, whatever you want to call it, why would this entity want this? Well, number one, JMJ coin holders might say to XZ state, if you give us safe harbor and basically not only safe harbor, but also this restorative option. So give us safe harbor, give us an exemption, give us a no action letter. And if you'll, sanction this restorative, we will declare that Randy, who's a coin holder, is saying he is, so Randy or Randy's representative. So let's assume there's a representative layer where somebody could act as a representative for Randy, so he doesn't have to totally disclose his true identity. But there's a trusted, let's say it's an attorney. Randy can say, okay, I assert that I am you can treat me like a resident of XZ state. Okay. So Randy's considered a resident of XZ. Randy agrees to pay taxes to XZ in order to qualify for the safe harbor and restorative compensation. And Randy also has incentive to align and associate with state XZ, which accomplishes XZ's desire to be at the forefront of this decentralization. Does that make sense? And XZ can look at, A, B, and C, look at their characteristics, the federation of coaches and backstops and so forth, and they have the prerogative to say, okay, we know A, B, and C. We can see what their financial position is, and they may be DAOs as well, but they know that there's a history of operation and trust and so forth, and they can say, okay, we will grant token holder Randy or Randy's representative this safe harbor, this access to restoration, if you declare that you're a resident of XZ, abide by our rules, and pay taxes. That makes sense? Charlie, I don't know if you're watching this, but that's kind of the end of my pitch. So anyway, this, and I've asked Joseph to, work with me on this and get his opinion on it. But this seems like more dynamic, more permissive, more able to leverage the local and the technical knowledge of, A, B, and C to evaluate, Joseph, Mark, and Jay, and their willingness to provide some sort of financial backstop in case something goes wrong is an endorsement or a like an underwriting of whatever Joseph, Mark, and Jay are up to, and they have A, B, and C foundations have the incentive to keep tabs on what's going on. If Joseph, Mark, and Jay end up on the French Riviera, and yachts, there's probably going to be some follow-up.
So I just want to clear something.
Sure.
So I see where the state's coming in, A, B, and C. I'm assuming these are the DAOs or the
The foundations.
So these are the foundations.
These are the foundations.
Gotcha. Okay, never mind. That's good.
So to put names on this might be the Bitcoin Foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, maybe the Stellar Foundation. And, I'm not an expert on those foundations or whatever, but those will serve as like established decentralized constructs that have a certain amount of financial wherewithal that they could sort of provide a financial backstop for whatever's happening in this startup, if you will, decentralized startup.
I think a key part of this is that, and maybe it was implied, the federal regulators will have to, like this, will first take action for the federal, require action from the federal regulators to carve out this exemption to the state regulators to say, hey, we'll let you take the lead on this, to where, because even if, right now, if the state says we're going to make this sandbox, you can still run afoul of, SEC laws, the stuff that's federal. So it would take I think require the federal regulators to first take action and say, you state can apply and we'll give these exemptions to you that, follow to anybody who runs through your safe harbor sandbox.
Probably an executive order to kind of get that environment set up in the federal government side.
It's going to be a dance among all the different layers of, the jurisdictions. And I don't know exactly how that would be accomplished. It just seems like this is a potential pathway for that stack of agreements among the different layers of the regulatory bodies to say, okay, if state XZ, if you think there's a viable way for people that have put up 5 mil to get X number of coins, if something happens and there's some big loss, they could come in, burn their coins, and in exchange for some sort of partial reimbursement, we're on board with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in the paper that I'm writing right now, this is kind of the like legislation adoption that I'm sort of proposing, is that basically, just in the same way the idea of states are laboratories of democracy, there should be like this, sandboxes in different states to try out, to basically create all these different laboratories, regulatory laboratories to experiment with. And I think it's, back to what I was saying and what you hinted at with, government not being able to keep pace. I think this does go in the right direction of the federal government, or just regulatory bodies in general, and understanding and embracing that they don't have the wherewithal or the technical competence to be able to create forward-looking laws, where they're much better off spending their resources saying, let's try this where we have
like, because I'm approaching it in the space of NFTs that are backed by physical assets. So I think that when it's backed by a physical asset is maybe a little more palatable at first, because you don't need this fund, because things can't go to zero. You can always still pull out your share or get in return your share of that.
Like having a lien on an automobile.
Exactly.
Versus a unsecured
and then
loan.
you just require insurance for that asset. So, you know, even if it burns in a fire or whatever, there's still a way to recover. So it's not a full risk. But anyways, I think, you know, that's a way for the government to better use their regulatory resources to say, let's do it in a way where we can yank the plug if we need to, if we're like, hey, this is, you know, nobody realized this would be causing XYZ harm. We have the ability to yank the plug, but it's also creating, I think, an environment where the regulators who normally are so removed from the loop, because rather than try to work with regulators who say, well, you know, it's just not going to happen. And even then, you know, it'll be 3 years before we have a law that allows you to do what you want to do. So these entities
Or
who are
10.
cutting. What's that? Yeah, or 10, exactly.
Or 10.
Yeah, these entities on the cutting edge, rather than try to work with regulators and keep them apprised of what's going on, they're like, how do we, it's just all about how do we circumvent them, or how do we just do it anyways, like, you know, the behemoths do, Facebook, Elon, whatever. They just like, we're going to do it anyways, and just whatever happens, it's a cost of business, and we don't even care at that point. Or like Ripple, whatever, it's like, you know, we're just going to do it. And by the time they have regulation, it's going to be so far down the road that we can't, you know, it's not even worth thinking about. So we'll just blast through it anyways, which I think is an example of how their current laws just don't even, not only are they stifling innovation if people follow them, but in their state, that in their current state, they're not even doing what they're proposing to do, because people just blow through them anyways.
Mark, I'd be curious to hear your opinion on something when you get a second.
But yeah, I mean, just to wrap up what I'm saying, I think that's a way to keep regulators to where they're actually learning, you know, hand in hand with the people who are on the cutting edge of this, because they're incentivized to work with the regulators and say, you know, here's what we're doing, and give them a better understanding of what's going on.
I'd like to make a point before Charlie adds his thoughts and comments. So another dimension of this that's attractive from the state and the incumbent and existing regulatory realm, I think this clearly separates the rules and regulations that apply to centralized institutions, so that those existing rules and regulations are not undermined. And this opens up a new path for decentralized constructs to move forward rapidly. Because I think one of the things that's happening now with DeFi and, you know, all the innovation that's going on is, if I was running a bank and I was subject to all these, you know, existing laws and everything, basically having my you know, hands cuffed, I would be going, well, why should I follow the old rules when these new guys are coming along and they're able to do anything and just run circles around us? So I think, you know, this is a path that goes a long way to maintaining the integrity of the legacy centralized regulatory realm. So you're not undermining that as this new innovation is happening. This is just another decentralized 180-degree opposite approach to getting to the same point, which is, if something goes wrong, what is the recourse for the consumer, right? So I'm sorry, Charlie.
No, that's actually the point I was going to touch on. You just nailed it. So, I mean, it's really kind of like, well, what area are we talking about? And when you get to banking, the regulations compound very, very quickly. So you're seeing that in the DeFi space, and you saw that even with, and whether this changes a year from now, or we'll see, but you know, Coinbase basically being a publicly traded company and operating within the jurisdiction of the SEC got denied basically their kind of DeFi applications, right? Or like collateralized loans applications. So I mean, that's a really good example where there's other people doing exactly what Coinbase is already basically applying to do, and they're working within the realm or within the coloring within the lines, right? And they're like, nope, we're not doing that. So that's Jay. I think that kind of goes right to your point. Now, Mark, to your point, I mean, with an asset-backed NFT or something that is pegged to something and isn't involved in if it's not involved in lending, if it's not involved in collateralization or what that looks like, DeFi loans. I mean, you're going to have less regulatory hurdles. Jay, I'm just curious if you had any thought about if there's specific areas that states could maybe start with without having to worry about some of those, crossing some of those boundaries that, you just compound the amount of regulations that you're trying to kind of swim upstream against.
I would say the prime realm to play with, I would start to experiment with this in the NFT realm.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think you have a better defined target and asset category to identify, control, and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And also, as we've discussed in prior sessions, in my mind, as we're working through the non-fungible tokens, the need and the role of a guardian or some sort of agent that is putting a stamp of authenticity on it, also serving as a proxy for the identity of whoever the content creator is. That's especially important in a conflict situation like the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Then I think that's, in my mind, a very natural, very conducive way to start small and test this out. And then, it could be expanded from there as history and, a number of opinions and eyes and experience plays on that. So does that sound reasonable, Charlie?
Yeah, and I agree. And I would also add tokenized assets on there. Through and honestly, if you could, non-lending smart contracts that have maybe some cash flow. I mean, I look at it and I think of Arizona. There's a lot of people that could potentially increase their monthly fixed income, through some of these things, whether it's rental property or interest on some sort of collateral or like physical asset backed appreciation, or I don't know. I mean, you could stay outside of lending, still increase cash flow for people through a very legitimate effort that can be tokenized or represented, through NFTs, something like that. But I think as a state, if you can say, well, hey, we're going to open up the ability for retirees to increase their monthly cash flow through this sandbox opportunity, I personally think that would be a huge value add for the state, or individual county for that matter. So I guess motivation wise, that's something to consider.
Yeah, I'm going to screen share and then we're going to wrap it up and we'll turn off the recording and the live stream. But I want to point to some technical resources that I think are conducive to this, and that's within the Stellar realm. So this is the stellar.org website, and what I've discovered, I've been doing a deep dive into Stellar, but this is under the Learn, this Stellar Quest, although it looks like the project has kind of gone dormant, but Stellar Quest, I think, is an excellent resource for starting to get your arms around the Stellar ecosystem and the technology and so forth. And this is where you can learn about, NFTs, and like a year ago or whatever, you could earn XLM, but I'll just leave it for people to investigate and explore, and I'm doing the same. But this is like a hands-on, step-by-step kind of gamified way to learn about the ins and outs of Stellar. And in my view, exactly what you talked about, Charlie, there's technology baked into the Stellar platform that's ideal for creating any kind of digital asset that might reflect, a real asset. There's a lot of flexibility in the Stellar ecosystem and technology to do that. So the other thing that I'd point out in this is this, let's see, community foundation, where is it? There's a list of projects. Let's see. Oh, here's the projects. So this project in particular, this Realty Bits, I think is an excellent project that represents what can be done with real estate in combination with, it's not coming up for some reason, getting a 406 error. But if you look at Realty Bits and look at some of the, and I have no financial interest in Realty Bits or any of that stuff. I'm just impressed with what they have created. But if you look at some of the talks by the founder that are on YouTube, they talk about Realty Bits and what they've done to build it, the team behind it, and all that sort of thing. I think you'll see that there's an opportunity to apply some of these concepts to real life situations that can make a lot of sense. So I'll stop screen sharing there. Any final comments before we turn off the live stream and the recording and so forth? I appreciate the conversation on this, and anybody watching this, if you got feedback, feel free to contact me, Jay Carpenter at desertblockchain.com, and that's JAY Carpenter at desertblockchain.com. So any final thoughts, closing thoughts, whatever? And Charlie, you can stay on and join us for our lunch chat and whatever.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, if the law students out there, I think these conversations are super valuable. I think having I know Lee Reisner over at Duke Laws talks to Jimmy Lenz about kind of these intersectional of between technology and law and how that affects policy. And I'm glad to see that they're starting it at the college, or a collegiate level with law schools. And I think you guys are going to be translators for a lot of things. So, between policy and technology, we're going to see the role of law being very, very, very crucial. And so I'm just glad you guys are here. And I hope to see that being a continuing trend, because I think it's going to make a difference in the long run.
Cool. Anything you guys want to say? Randy, anything you want to say?
I appreciate the conversation. It's great.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, I'll tell you what's coming up. We have a monthly session that'll be on the 4th Wednesday of the month, which should be, according to my calculator or calendar, is Wednesday, April the 27th, and that'll be at 7 p.m. Arizona time. In between now and then, on these Saturday sessions, we're still going to meet. We're going to be working on some projects, but it won't be announced If you're a Desert Blockchain citizen, you will get a link and a notice sometime around in the early morning on Saturdays about that. And we do appreciate you being a Desert Blockchain citizen. But the topic on the 27th might involve a new way that I'm working on to apply non-fungible tokens in the artistic expression and experiential realm. So I'm still working on that, and you know, stay tuned for that. Join us on MEETUP, and yeah, that's it. Thanks for your time and attention. And I'm going to turn off the recording and the live stream, and yeah, join us again on the second Saturdays of the month is this open house. So thanks.